So the name of Unit 6 is Consequences of Industrialization, i.e. there's a lot of imperialism that's going on within this particular time frame. And remember, it's the same time frame as Unit 5. So whereas Unit 5 were political and the Industrial Revolution, now we look at some of the fallout, the effects. So it's pretty clear that causation is going to play a heavy role in all of this. First off, we take a look at different concepts of governance. First image we see here is an image of the so-called Berlin Conference, sometimes known as the Scramble for Africa. We see the map of Africa in the background, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck in the middle. I mean, it's the Berlin Conference because the Germans hosted it. They referred to it as the Congo Conference, and we have representatives from different European nations trying to, in a sense, carve up Africa. They simply saw it as land for the taking. And we see in the back here the representative from the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottomans are still the sick man of Europe. They're declining, but they did try and position themselves as alternatives to these European powers. So they tried to make strategic alliances with different portions of the continent. So Africa plays a huge role in this. We see Europeans establish settler colonies in some parts of their empire. Here's an image of a settler colony known as New Zealand, and settler colony simply means that a colonizing group tries to replace the native inhabitants. So New Zealand and South Africa would be two of the biggest examples of this. And then finally, Japan acquiring territory is actually mentioned twice. They're mentioned by acquiring territories through Asia and the Pacific, but also by conquering and settling neighboring territories. So here we see that Japan, this is where they were 1875. They gained Taiwan, so they were victorious in the Sino-Japanese War. And then up here, Karafutu, Japan was successful in the Russo-Japanese War. And then going a little bit beyond the time frame, annexed by Japan, they take Korea, but Japan is starting to build in their influence. And this is a consequence of westernizing and industrializing, but on their own terms. So they're kind of quietly building up their power as an industrial nation. So we have state expansion. One of the other sides of governance would be indigenous responses to state expansion. So we have the Sepoy Rebellion or the 1857 rebellion in India. And the Sepoys were Indian soldiers that fought in the British Army. So as always, we simplify. Long story short, this begins because of the new type of rifles that these soldiers received, where they had to bite off the ends of the cartridges to reload them. There were issues with the grease that was being used. The Hindu soldiers believed that it was, we're looking at pig grease perhaps for the Muslims, cattle grease for the Hindus. Rebellion sets out. Here we see an image from the Sulu War. The Sulu Kingdom was a portion of what's now South Africa, so they resisted first Dutch and then British rule. And finally, we have the Xhosa cattle killing movement in the southern portion of Africa. So within all three of these, with the Xhosa, they believed that if they killed off their cattle, that would magically rebirth their former way of life. Spoiler alert, it led to starvation. But with the first example, the Indian revolt, that's direct resistance. With the Zulu, that's a creation of new state on the periphery. And then finally with the Xhosa, that's an example of rebellion against imperial rule. So three different types of indigenous responses. Technology and innovation, not a thing. So you get a reprieve. With humans and the environment, we are taking a look at global economic development. And realistically, we see Freemanpedia helps us out. This topic is all about raw materials that can be found around the world. So the need for raw materials in factories and increased food supplies for growing populations leads to the growth of export economies. So this just gives you a good idea of the different resources that could be found in different areas of the world, all to benefit the home country. So, I mean, if we take rubber, for example, we got rubber in the Congo Basin, rubber in the Amazon, palm oil in West Africa. And again, these are all things that are explicitly in the concept outline. Diamonds from South Africa, that's where De Beers got its name. So, I mean, you get the idea here of where different resources came from. Additionally, when we take a look at humans and the environment, 6.6 is all about causes of migration. So, how did environmental factors contribute to different patterns of migration? So, this map shows us where people went. And a lot of these things, again, are specifically mentioned, but when we look at environmental factors, we have, Indian migration to South Africa, Southeast Asia, Chinese immigration to South Asia, Australia, the Pacific, the Caribbean, South America, the United States, just all across the board. So what we're seeing is that we have changes in demographics that present challenges to existing patterns of living. And additionally, we have new modes of transportation. That's where consequences come into play. We have relocation to cities. And additionally, these migrants were able to return periodically or permanently to their home societies. So it could be a case of you migrate and then you go back home with some of the money you earned to help support your family. But we can clearly see migration with causes. This simply shows us where these people went. For cultural developments, right off the bat, very first topic, we're taking a look at rationales for imperialism. Social Darwinism, pretty famous political cartoon. We have Uncle Sam, and you can probably make out some of the wording here. We have Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba. US colonization imposing their society on what they viewed as quote unquote uncivilized peoples. So, I mean, the exact wording is a range of cultural, religious, racial ideologies are used to justify imperialism. Social Darwinism is amongst them. The concept of the civilizing mission is a part of it as well. And what we see here is an image from New Zealand, a Christian missionary speaking to members of the Maori, and they are the native New Zealanders. And again, another example of how you have the desire to convert native populations religiously so that eventually the quote unquote dominant society can take over. So, to a degree, this goes hand in hand with settler colonies, but this is a pattern that does go back even to Unit 3, where we see the establishment of different religious orders to spread Christian faiths. And then we saw it amp up in Unit 4 when Spanish and the Portuguese started to branch out, both with trade post empires, but also with larger maritime empires. As we look at economic systems, the Opium Wars are an example of economic imperialism. So, industrialized states and businesses within those states practiced economic imperialism, primarily Asia, as we see here, Latin America. This was a chance for England and France to kind of expand their influence in China. All right, so Britain was making bank through the sale of opium. The Chinese did ban it, and they did their best to keep this drug from infiltrating their country. The drug czar, Commissioner Lin, shut down opium dens. He seized the drugs. He tried to make an example by punishing the British, we'd say drug dealers, but the British saw it as an infringement on their economic freedoms. So that's why the gunboats came in. Additionally, when we look at economics, the other part of topic 6.6 are how economic factors contributed to patterns of migration. One of the more famous ones is Irish migration to the United States. 1840s to 1850s, potato famine. If you can't eat and can't feed your family, you want to go to a place where you can eat and eventually make enough money to feed your family. So, long story short, that leads millions of Irish to migrate to the United States. And it says in the concept outline, many individuals chose freely to relocate, often in search of work. And we use this example of free migration because there were some Irish that did stay behind. It wasn't as if everyone was forced to leave. So this new economy continued to rely on coerced and semi-coerced labor migration, of which convict labor is one of them. Best example, Australia, a penal colony, meaning prisoners settled there. Convict labor, best example we have. And then finally, social interactions and organization. We're looking at effects of migration. There were ethnic enclaves that were created in different parts of the world. So here we see one of numerous examples of Chinatowns. All right, these enclaves where a Chinese populace primarily lived and in many places worked. So there's the example of Chinese. There was, the Irish migrating to North America, living in enclaves, Italians in North and South America. Chinatown's one of the more famous examples. We also have the reality that receiving societies did not always embrace these immigrants, and there were policies that were designed to maybe limit this migration. We have the Chinese Exclusion Act, but we also have the example of the White Australia policy. So here, the great national policy song, the concept of limiting migration, perhaps to those of European descent. All right, definitely a degree of ethnic and racial prejudice that's involved with this ideology. Now, the target reasoning process here is causation. Definitely, when you look at the last two topics, causes of migration, effects of migration, it's clear that causation is going to factor into it. So take a moment. This particular learning objective is the final learning objective of this unit. Look at the prompt, determine how you would address it. What's the proof you would use? How would you contextualize it? What claim would you make?